You had an interesting article as well that I think has a more positive spin. I think, if nothing else, a more positive spin for those who are a fan of some certain authors and potentially might find it really cool, might find it a little bit strange. So break this down for us, because I hadn't heard about this until you mentioned it.
Yeah, so this is really interesting. So credit where credit's due. This is the initiator of this, the guy that builds these things, is called Derek Schurman, like Schurman. So I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that exactly correct. Make sure we give credit to him. And I heard the story on The World and Everything in It, which is a really fantastic news podcast put out by the World News Group. If you're not a fan, if you're not somebody who listens to that, I will just give it my highest endorsement. It is a very good news program and news company that tells it from an unapologetically Christian worldview. So heads up, if you're not Christian, they're going to come from that perspective. But I think they do it in a really good, honest way, in the sense that it's the bias is admitted and it's upfront, and that it's easy to see. And I've really appreciated. They have a magazine that I've subscribed to for years, but they have this daily podcast that I think is really, really good called The World and Everything in It. And this article appeared on The World and Everything in It today, and we'll have links in the transcript, links below to the transcript of that article. But so here's the article. Sherman is taken as a computer scientist by trade. And he's taken the large language model ChatGPT, and he's trained it. And David and I were talking before we started recording about how he did this, and we're not entirely sure. David, what was your best explanation? He took the API and did some programming work on it. Is that the way you set it up?
Yeah, long story short, since the ChatGPT API has been released, now people are able to take the logic, the system that allows ChatGPT to do what it does, and they're able to essentially configure it so that when they have their own set of data, they're able to get it to fulfill much more specific purposes, rather than relying on the infrastructure that OpenAI has set up with their massive data set.
Yeah, and so there's a whole lot that we can talk about here in a minute. But so the first thing that was fascinating here is this guy basically is taking it, and in his case, taking old Christian theologians, inputting that as the data set. And then the result of that, if you think about this, like, again, this is one of those things that when you think about it, you go, oh, that makes sense. The result of it is that since then the language model uses that data set, you can basically talk to that person. And so started with a somewhat lesser known Dutch theologian named Abraham Kuyper. Did it first with him, and then more recently and perhaps famously has done it for J.R. Tolkien, John Calvin, and the article in World and Everything in It had to do with C.S. Lewis. And so it was really fascinating. The reporter was basically asking, out loud, questions of C.S. Lewis, quote unquote, and in a voice that sounded faintly English and a lot like C.S. Lewis's voice, at least as you might imagine it to be. The AI was answering, and the answers giving sounds tremendously like Lewis, which makes sense because I assume what has happened is it's been fed Lewis's entire works of books and letters, and there's quite a huge body of work that you could feed a machine. So the Sherman is sort of touting this as a way to use AI as an educational tool. What would it be like to be able to talk to an ancient author and ask them about their ideas and all those kinds of things? And then basically AI brings them back to life in some sense, in the sense that it uses their own words and their own thoughts and then reconfigures them in a way that sounds like and acts like having a conversation. So I think that's fascinating. I mean, like I'm pretty curious. I haven't tried it yet, but it would be really interesting to go have a chatbot discussion with J.R. Tolkien or with C.S. Lewis. So in that sense, there's a little bit of a gee whiz kind of interesting part of it. But there's also some interesting implications from an educational standpoint, which we know something about since we work for an education company. And I can see where that would be an educational process to have that conversation. But David, I actually went a different direction. And to me, and so give me your perspective on this, this is actually a much more fascinating way to use AI than what people are currently using AI. I feel like the sort of popular way to use AI and ChatGPT specifically right now is like an enhanced search engine. So I go to the internet, I type something into Google. Now I go to ChatGPT and I'm expecting a much richer, nuanced, layered response to my search queries, basically, which for reasons we'll talk about in a second, I have not found to be particularly helpful personally. But this idea of a closed AI that was fed a specific data set and then is able to kind of reimagine and reorganize that data set in a way that makes it conversation to talk about. I think that's a pretty fascinating application. This feels to me, if you've been with us listeners for a while, this feels to me a little bit more like the Star Wars droids that we've used, or I've used several times as an example of, maybe the more benign side of AI. So what do you think, David? Give me your opinion.
Yeah, it's a really interesting concept. And I think that, it has some really interesting implications, and I think that it can be really neat. But I do think that it definitely has its limits. And just because when you hear that there is a chatbot that would allow you to talk to C.S. Lewis and have a conversation with C.S. Lewis, really what you are getting, what you have to understand that you're getting, is that you're just talking to a system that is just taking all the information that it has available about and from C.S. Lewis directly. That does not mean that you are talking to a replication of C.S. Lewis as a person. And I think this is a pretty important distinction, that if you can't look at what a chatbot like that comes up with as gospel truth and rely upon it and tout it nearly as much as you can the actual live works. And I don't think that's a particularly controversial take, but I think it's a useful thing to keep in mind with something like this, as the article reading through it says that it talked about, from Lewis's perspective, the bots had a hallucination where it talked about Lewis talking about his perspective being married again, but he was only ever married once.
Yeah,
so,
I was actually going to highlight that. That was the thing I mentioned earlier, David. And actually, it might be worth just reading from the transcript here. The reporter says, still, ChatGPT does make mistakes. I asked the Lewis chatbot why C.S. Lewis married his wife, Joy Davidman, and this is part of its answer. So the chatbot responds, we realized that our connection was much more than just friendship, despite our age difference and the fact that I had never contemplated marrying again after the loss of my beloved wife. Joy and I fell deeply in love. Okay, now the reporter picks up here and said, that's not true. C.S. Lewis was only married once to Joy, and she's the one who died. When ChatGPT makes up information like this, developers call it hallucinating. It's a major limitation of the technology. Well, that's the understatement of the article.
Yeah.
That's why, as I said earlier, I'm less infatuated with ChatGPT as a search engine, because I honestly don't have much confidence at all in the responses unless I already know the answer. And so when I go to Google, I generally don't know the answer. And then I'm using my own intelligence to sort through, not that everything you Google is correct, but to sort through various sources. And this happened in church actually last Sunday, David. We had a discussion after church, and for some reason we talked, the sermon had been about Jonah, and the book of Jonah had been read, and we were talking about Jonah. And I'd said, I'd seen a news story several years ago about ISIS had blown up Jonah's tomb, and it caught my attention because I was like, I didn't know Jonah's tomb was a thing, that it was known, and where was it, stuff. And so, got out the phone and Googled Jonah's tomb, and quickly sort of sorted through some different articles that said the tomb that I was thinking about had been close to the present day Mosul, but there was actually several claims of different tombs and all those kinds of things. Yeah, and that's what the internet is fascinating for. In less than 5 minutes, I had a bunch of pretty decent sources. Wasn't ready to write a research paper to be published, but had enough context and information to be reasonably sure that I was giving generally accurate information into our discussion, which then turned upon this information about Jonah's tomb that we just discovered. Now, if I had put into ChatGPT, tell me about Jonah's tomb, I would not have trusted the results because it so frequently hallucinates. You're likely to come up with a bunch of stuff that is just complete garbage. So that's where David, I find this fascinating, not because I'm interested in a chatbot to discuss with C.S. Lewis, although that's got a kind of a gee whiz, ain't that cool sort of thing. I'm much more interested in this as its own tool. As somebody who works with a lot of content, and as a company that does a lot of content and develops content, I think it's rather fascinating the implications that you could take and seal off AI and feed it all your own information, stuff that and then let it resort and represent that information in new ways. That seems to me to be a really powerful tool. And there was a phrase that I just thought was fascinating here, used in this one article called ChatGPT and the Rise of AI by Sherman. And let me see if I can scroll down and find it here, David. It says Fred Brooks, who he identifies as a respected Christian computer scientist. Never heard of him before, so there you go. wrote, "It's time to recognize that the original goals of AI were not merely extremely difficult. They were goals that, although glamorous and motivating, sent the discipline off in the wrong direction." And then that was more in context of the rest of the article, and that's interesting. But this next line it sets up is really interesting. Brooks advocates for IA. So instead of AI, IA. And then that's defined as intelligence amplifying systems over AI, suggesting people and machines will be able to do far more than AI alone. And then he has an example. One of my colleagues at Calvin University has been exploring the use of AI for helping people write better as opposed to writing for them. Okay, I thought this phrase was fascinating, David. Intelligence amplifying, which is basically taking these tools and instead of using it as standalone content developers or even returning factual information like a search engine, instead amplifying something that's already been working on and being able to use it in a new way. So anyhow, I just thought that phrase is really, really interesting.
Yeah, that's a really interesting concept. I really like the idea because it pretty much lines up with a lot of what we've talked about here on this podcast about what the proper use of technology should be. And that is to take the things that you as a human are already capable of doing and making them either more efficient or better, or allowing you to do more of the more significant, important things that you as a human were created to do rather than more menial tasks. And so I think that really lines up with that. I guess it's just so much of a difference from what the AI models that most people are familiar with now do. And really just how large language models and things like that work is just by getting fed a bunch of content and then being really good at reproducing new content based on all of the content that it already had access to. And so I think if we want to head in that direction, which I think that there's a very good argument for us doing, you would really have to make a very concerted push for that. And you would really have to determine what that looks like practically and how it can practically benefit people. I haven't looked a whole lot into this concept. You telling me about this here is the first time I'm hearing about it, but I would be very curious to see how it could be practically implemented, such as that example of how it would help a student to write something rather than actually writing something for them, because I think that there could be potentially some gray areas in there where it could try to give examples, but not actually fully complete the assignment as outlined. And so there's some really interesting implications, and I would be very curious to see how they come about.
Yeah, I was thinking about this, David, and sort of thinking about like some of the implications. And I was thinking, listeners, in context of our business, which is education and do project-based education, which in some ways is alternative higher education. And so we just had a staff meeting actually earlier today where we were taking a bunch of ideas and throwing on the table, and everybody's kind of picking at them and sort of rephrasing them, resetting them and rethinking them. And it was a really good brainstorming session. But part of the reason we're putting the ideas at the table was because I started to recognize that I had some internal presuppositions about what people who use our product wanted and the value of it was. And it was starting to fly in the face of the reality and the empirical evidence of what they actually needed. Well, that happens all the time. And in fact, we had a really fascinating discussion with our admissions team where somebody who still works for us and worked on the admissions team last year said, well, hey, based on my experience last year, people acted this way. And the current admissions team said, yeah, you're right, they did, but they're not acting that way this year. So that's becoming more and more common that, like within a year, consumer behavior is very different. Mm-hmm. And so they're kind of coming and saying, actually, things change pretty quickly. Well, that's fascinating because what we do is the same, but the pieces of it that are valued are looking different. But here from a business standpoint, David, it's actually quite expensive and a real problem if it takes you a year or a year and a half or 18 months or 24 months to realize that, then a couple more months to dig at it and figure out what's going on, then a couple more months to reset and rebuild, and then to come out with something else. I mean, that could cost you the business. I mean, that's a long turn, right? So I was sitting there thinking, yes, but would it be fascinating if you had an AI that you fed all of your material, and so the AI generally understood what you did and the content you put in it, and then you were able to say, what do you think is the most effective part of our program? what is that, and that'd be interesting if you start to put in like the responses from your students. Like, when you ask students to write, what was the best part of your program? And you start pushing that in. And now the AI is like pulling stuff out, and it doesn't have some of these. Now, it's not that AI doesn't have biases. It would obviously clearly have biases on the material that you wrote itself, but it would not have these sort of subterranean biases that, in my mind, there was a way that the students are interacting with our program and the reason that it's valuable and an ideal student. And all of a sudden, I'm confronted with evidence. It's like, actually, I don't think that's ever really been true. But for a whole bunch of complicated human reasons, that's the way I perceived it. AI might be able to cut through some of that and show us that in a whole different way, which, if it could do so, would be really tremendously faster than sort of catching up to it the other way, and yet not creating content, merely reflecting certain aspects of our own content in a way like a brainstorming session that goes, oh yeah, that makes sense. What you just said there that we do, that's actually more valuable than we thought it was. So anyhow, that was a whole different scenario for me. And I was thinking about it and thinking, now there's a use for AI that seems to me much more practical for the world that I live in. AI is obviously quite practical for people screening cancer patients at the moment. But where I don't want it to write me an original article, but I would love for it to summarize 10 articles that I wrote and see patterns in it that I may not have seen because of my own inherent sort of subconscious perspectives.
Yeah. I think that kind of goes back to our earlier discussion of what AI is good at, and that is at like looking at data and finding patterns. And that's a really fascinating use case for it. And I think it's one of the reasons why, if we're able to figure out how to fine tune it so that the AI, its own biases on analyzing the data are limited, is that I think just about anybody who works in any sort of scientific field will tell you that you can look at a data sheet and then two different scientists with two different biases will come away from a data sheet with entirely different conclusions, because at the end of the day, they have different experiences, different perspectives on the world that they're coming at it with, and they're going to come away with different conclusions. And AI is potentially could be really helpful in the sense that it doesn't have any of those biases. Now, granted, sometimes those biases can be really helpful and can be in the sense of additional context for the reason for why that study was done in the first place, and some other external circumstances surrounding the data that the AI might not be able to take advantage of. But in this particular case that you're talking about, I think that it has the potential to be really helpful if you already have a solid grasp of the mission and the vision of what you are trying to accomplish with the data, and then you're able to look at it from that perspective. Because, yeah, like you've said, it's especially when you're trying to determine something like consumer behavior, which, frankly, I would argue is one of the most challenging fields of study that you can go into and try to keep up to date on. Could have some really interesting insights if you're able to apply it well and understand what the purpose of the data is and how to use it.
I was trying to think of some examples, David, and this is contrived, but it's kind of like if I was talking to a friend and I was like, we really need to get a new car. Our cars are wearing out and it's time to replace them. And so my wife and I are just having this big discussion. My wife wants a passenger vehicle so we can, put the kids in and drive them around, stuff like that. But I actually, haul some things occasionally and need the storage space. And so I really want a truck. But there's not a truck that hauls enough people, and there's not really a passenger vehicle that hauls enough material. And so we've been kind of chasing our tails and going round and round about this in terms of what car we should get, right? And so then the friend says, well, hey, I actually know you guys really well. And I know that while you occasionally do need to haul materials, you haul materials like 10% of the time or 20% of the time, 80% of the time, you actually haul people. Have you ever thought about getting a van? Because, the minivan with the stow and go seats, you can flip all the seats down, you can stick your plywood in the back and haul a bunch of material. And as long as it's not messy, no problem. And then most of the time you're going to be using it for seats anyhow. And you go, oh, why? I was thinking about a car or a truck. And now you said van. And that's kind of a smash up of the two. And that's exactly right. And you're right. I only haul material like 20% of the time. And it's one of those things. It's like, you were talking to your wife and you got a vision of a Ford F-150 and you're trying to justify and say like, oh, I got to haul material here and haul material there and do all this and do all that stuff. And all of a sudden you're this person that hauls material all the time. And that's central to your identity. And subconsciously, because you're human, you don't want to come off of that because you're actually fighting for the F-150 and you've also taken some stake with your wife. When your wife loves you too, but she's got identity built around hauling kids around. And so she's trying to kind of defend the same identity subconsciously. So neither of you are really arguing, but both of you are stating how important, and you're finding facts to back up what is already a kind of pre-selected, thing. And then you have this third party that comes in and says, I know you pretty well, and here's the reality. And when you hear it from somebody else, you go, it is actually kind of the reality. And then they say, do this. And you're like, oh yeah, well, that actually makes a lot of sense. Now, that presumes that you have a friend who knows you well enough, B, is willing to take that kind of risk, and C, you're smart enough to ask them. And, I don't know about you, but I can put that on one hand, the amount of times I've been smart enough to do that. But now take that into a business setting or something like that and think about an AI who would be able to sort of identify those patterns quite easily and almost automatically. And all of a sudden, it becomes a really powerful tool, not for creating something new, but for cutting through unconscious perspectives that are not allowing you to see some clear information. That I think is really fascinating. And it's not a way I've thought about using AI before. It's kind of the most interesting one that I've come across so far in my own life. There's lots of interesting things, using AI to screen for cancer is really cool. But in terms of my own personal use, I think, that I could see where that would be really helpful. So.
Yeah. I think it just speaks to the value of having alternative perspectives on things, and the fact that just our nature as humans is to only rely on our perspective and how we understand the world. And being able to recognize other perspectives that are helpful, even if they are limited in their usefulness and their own understanding of context, like AI would be, or even like a friend would be. At the end of the day, considering other perspectives is just extremely helpful. So. Hey, thank you for checking out this clip of the Alternative Ideas podcast. If you want to check out some of the other full episodes of this podcast or some other clips just like this one, you can check them all out here on the Alternative Ideas YouTube channel.